COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Rural Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre el liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo del público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
Español. Perfecto, vamos al inglés, por favor.
English booth, testing 1 2 1 2.
The second call.
Second console in the English booth, 1 2 3.
Português. Português. Perfeito, se escuta bem. Segunda consola. Tudo bem. Escuto bem. Francês. Aló, francés. Cabina francés. Cabina de francés, por favor. Francés, francés. Aló. Aló, aló, aló. Aló. Francés. Ande atrás, perfecto. Segunda consola. Perfecto, gracias.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to all member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, The Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by
this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, having taken account of quorum this morning, we have enough to resume. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. Firstly, I apologize for not being here this morning, and we thank Ambassador Sanders for ably chairing the sessions this morning. And now we turn to the next item on our agenda, as requested by the delegations of Canada, Chile, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the United States, which is entitled, "The Situation of Persons Deprived of Liberty for Political Reasons in the Americas, Memory and the Present." As outlined in document CP/INF 10410/24, the purpose of including this topic on our agenda is to foster a constructive discussion on the situation of individuals deprived of liberty for political reasons in our region. This discussion also serves as an initial step towards exploring the potential establishment of an Inter-American Day Against Political Imprisonment. So with this in mind, we will now proceed with the interventions of our invited panelists, both in person and virtually, who will offer their testimonies on this important issue. I think before we proceed with our first invited panelist, I would like to offer the floor to the delegation of Canada for a brief presentation on this item. So, Canada, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all delegations who are here to continue with the Permanent Council this afternoon. And thank you to the Mission of Colombia for holding such an elegant and beautiful reception this afternoon. Congratulations, it was a success, Ambassador. Mr. Chair, the Permanent Mission of Canada, on its own behalf and on behalf of the Permanent Missions of Chile, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the United States, is pleased to facilitate this session to raise awareness on the situation of persons deprived of liberty for political reasons in the Americas. I would also like to thank Ms. Mendez, Ms. Tellez, and Mr. Zamora for their willingness to appear before this Council today to provide insights on the harms perpetuated by this practice. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Freedom House and thank them for their continual work and dedication to this important matter. Mr. Chair, as we commemorate Human Rights Day, it is important to reflect that imprisonment for political reasons has historically been a significant tool of repression used by authoritarian actors in the Americas in past decades. These actions caused irreversible harm to both the victims and their families. The ongoing struggle for truth, justice, and memory related to their past must continue and be honored. In recent years, there has been a troubling resurgence of this practice across the region. It is why Canada and the requesting delegations have proposed the designation of an Inter-American Day Against Political Imprisonment. The establishment of this day will ensure that every year the members of the OAS commemorate the sad history of political prisoners in the hemisphere, including the great personal losses involved for the victims and their families, and to call for the release of any remaining political prisoners of undemocratic regimes. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the Mission of Mexico for their initiative today and Justices Eduardo Ferrer, MacGregor Poisson, and Humberto Antonio Sierra Porto for their years of service and commitment to uphold the values of the inter-American human rights system. On this Human Rights Day, Canada would like to reiterate our commitment to working with partners in the region to hold ground and advance human rights in the Americas, including the rights of women and girls, 2S LGBTQI+ persons, and Indigenous peoples. I would like to end by extending our sincere thanks to all the members of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Honorable Commissioners and Rapporteurs, and the Justices, and the staff of their secretariats, as well as the Department for Access to Rights and Equity, that together contribute to maintaining a robust, credible, and independent inter-American human rights system. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Now I'm pleased to invite Mr. Jose Carlos Zamora, the son of Mr. Jose Ruben Zamora, a journalist and founder of El Periódico in Guatemala. Please proceed.
Thank you. Embajadores, representantes permanentes.
Distinguished ambassadors, permanent representatives, alternate representatives, members of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, judges of the same, delegates, panelists, it's a great honor to address you today. And I am very, very grateful to have the opportunity to speak of the use of political imprisonment in our region and the obvious need to fight against this practice in order to strengthen democracy. It's happening again. This is a regional phenomenon that is spreading, not diminishing. The use of political imprisonment for the purposes of the repressive regimes have a manual of practices that uses preventive imprisonment as a way of silencing critics, and whether they be journalists or private members of society. This includes Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, certainly, but more recently in Peru, you have the case of the journalist Gustavo Tarrita and El Salvador, in my own country, Guatemala, where just last week there was an order sent out to imprison Juan Luis Font. In my case, Jose Ruben Zamora, my father, offers an emblematic example. My father was held arbitrarily by the state of Guatemala for 813 days in conditions that are considered torture per international law. Although this was domiciliary imprisonment over 53 days. That measure was, in fact, canceled by the public offices, and he was threatened with going back to a dark, humid, rat-infested cell any minute. This was a cell that was, in fact, part of the public ministry, and we know that a number of justices that were accomplices to this were presuming to fight networks of corruption, but in fact were simply fighting democracy. And this is happening again, where the presumed means of justice are used to punish and to silence voices that are not the same as one's own, and sending out, therefore, an alert. You want to try this? This is what you can expect to the rest of society. This isn't a question of ideology. This is done exclusively to abuse power, to corrupt, to help organize crime, and to persist in abuses to human rights. This is a pattern that is all too often repeated. The public ministry may take a decision very quickly. Judges that are accomplices and who are very willing to state what is not true deny access to his file or to her file to the person who is being attacked, and where cases are held under reserve, where there's an alleged organized crime involvement, and where then orders of capture and preventive imprisonment is the norm. All of this, of course, is to ruin the reputation of the political person in question. In the case of my father, he was attacked, and so too his newspaper, who for 27 years worked to make sure that that newspaper was a form of absolute fundamental news for the Guatemalan people. But without that, 260 persons who were working there were suddenly without a job. 9 different people had to, or journalists had to leave the country in a hurry, and my mother and the rest of us had to leave very quickly, and my father was left alone and isolated. In 72 hours, a process, a trial that was trumped up from the get-go, arbitrary imprisonment, judges that were bought off, physical torture as well as psychological torture that has been documented by UN experts. All of this is a violation not only of human rights, that's bad enough. It is something that goes to the heart of the sense of justice in Guatemala or in other countries, because to maintain this kind of practice, one has to be willing to attack the presence of persons who violate human rights and who are absolutely acting in unbridled fashion in the country. And until all of the countries in this region understand what's happening and commit to upholding human rights and to listen to criticism, including the voices of newspaper people, this will continue. We can no longer tolerate this. Political imprisonment is truly abhorrent. It has to stop. And we call on everyone to find the means by which, obviously the legal means by which, one can combat this scourge, and by which the perpetrators can in fact be brought to justice, and those who are suffering torture can be finally set free. To end on a slightly lighter note, I would like to thank the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for their patience in listening to me, as I am so often on the social networks. Thank you.
Mr. Zamora, for your contribution to today's discussions. Thank you. Now I'm pleased to invite the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment, Mr. Juan Mendez, to share reflections on this important matter. Before he begins, though, we would also like to take a moment to congratulate Mr. Mendez on his birthday today. Happy birthday, Mr. Mendez. And we extend our warmest wishes for a wonderful year ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Quiero agradecer al Consejo Permanente.
I'd like to thank the Permanent Council for inviting me to attend this very important session on the day to celebrate universal human rights. That's December 10th. And also to celebrate the initiative that several countries have taken to be sure that we could bring into the agenda today a matter of such importance as this one. We're talking about the fight against political imprisonment in this hemisphere. Let me also thank the delegate for the United States for the very, very generous comments that were offered with my regard for the session this morning. In August of 1975 to February of 1977, I was imprisoned in Argentina. After that, I was forced into exile for some 6.5 years until the end of the military dictatorship in Argentina. I was originally arrested by a government that had constitutionally been elected, yes, but which was already showing certain authoritarian tendencies, and which, as my predecessor speaking just now, Mr. Zamora, would know very well. Then that arbitrary detention was simply prolonged without charges, without accusation, without any reason or ability for me to question it or fight it. During the dictatorship, that was that. The militaries the military people held me yet another year. I was arrested principally because of my role as a defender of other political prisoners. I'm a lawyer, and in memory of many of my colleagues who didn't live to tell the tale, let me say that we still have some 225 lawyers who are still among the disappeared, and another huge number, 120 or 130, who were arrested by orders of the executive without any formal charge or legitimate means, and who were thrown into jail and didn't very often live to tell the tale, or who were held for 5, 6, even 8 years. This is what you know as long and arbitrary detention. And so, as I was saying, in my case, this was, again, a detention that was not ordered by any trial. There was, therefore, nothing to question. There was no trial. I was arbitrarily thrown into jail. And finally, I was freed from jail, but immediately was taken to an airport and ordered to leave the country under risk of who knows what. Well, I did leave the country and certainly didn't dare go back so long as the dictatorship prevailed. This has been also a story all too common in the rest of the hemisphere. Many, many people who are deprived of liberty, who are arbitrarily thrown into jail, either because of something they wrote as journalists or because of some opinion they expressed in their peaceful life as a citizen, and without the use of judicial assistance, as Mr. Zamora was saying. So their right to freely express their views was, of course, violated, and very often their political status, even though many of these people have acted only peacefully, and I count myself, their personality, their profile was besmirched, and they were, in fact, unfairly targeted for doing this or thinking that. We're not including in this definition of politically detainees, not including those who are freely attacking the constitutional order. Those persons are not the people we have in mind. Think of the people who attacked the Congress 4 years ago here in Washington, who were rising up to avoid the peaceful turn of government after an election. And we saw the same thing not too long after that in Brazil. Those are not the people I'm describing, certainly not the group with which I would identify. These people were certainly not exercising their political views in a peaceful manner. And so when we speak of political prisoners, it's a different profile we have in mind. Nor should we consider political prisoners those who have committed torture. Those people should have to be judged and subject to due process, even though those are the very rules that they denied their own victims. But under the rule of law, there are rules of law. And the crimes against humanity, the crimes of torture or forced disappearance cannot be considered political mistakes, whatever the motivation. And that is why I believe that we here in this hemisphere need to resolve to free all political prisoners who are still under that particular regime. And I would hope that we could decide that at this very meeting, because judicial processes should take place in a free and transparent manner, because the failure of that system is another way of violating the rights and the freedom of those individuals. it's important that we think not just of the political prisoners, but of all prisoners who in some instances have indeed committed serious crimes, but that notwithstanding, they should be able to be judged by a group of their peers and not be thrown into jail without recourse. If we were to try to remember every one of the persons who have disappeared in this hemisphere for reasons of political bias, it would be a very long effort. And those who have perpetrated crimes against humanity, lesa humanidad, need also to be remembered. In this campaign that we are about to launch, we will also, I fear, have to insist on the importance of memory, truth, and justice that must be considered in order to fairly understand the weight of human rights in our continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mendes, for those very insightful comments. Our last panelist is Ms. Dora Maria Teles, who is a Nicaraguan historian and a politician who was deprived of liberty for political reasons in Nicaragua. Ms. Teles, she will be presenting virtually. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Organization of American States and the Secretary General Luis Almagro, as well as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that has done so much for political prisoners in Nicaragua. And thanks for including this point on the day in which we celebrate human rights. I'd like to thank the governments of Guatemala and the United States for receiving Nicaraguan political prisoners, and to Spain for offering the Spanish nationality to those who have had their nationality stripped. Today, after 15 days kidnapped by police forces of the Ortega Murillo family, Julio Antonio Quintana Carvajal, who is from the city of León in Nicaragua, continues disappeared at the order of the Ortega Murillo family. This is not the first time that they have put political opponents in prison. The Somoza dictatorship did the same and submitted, for example, submitted him to imprisonment and torture that caused a fractured rib, burns, cigarette burns, as well as an injury in the head that he, to this day, suffers long-term effects of. And now Julio is facing the same again. In the continent, prisoners of conscience have been imprisoned, and we do not know anything of them. Rocio San Miguel, who is Venezuelan and a human rights activist, was kidnapped in February of this year, and only a few days ago was she seen publicly 2 days ago with a clear deterioration of her health. Mr. Rivera has been missing for more than a year. The political imprisonment that thousands of people have suffered throughout the American continent, such as solitary confinement, physical torture, emotional and psychological abuse, sexual abuse, extortion of their families, continue to be open wounds for our communities and our peoples. This is the price that authoritarian regimes exact for for the social rejection of the elimination of their freedoms and their rights. And this is a mechanism that they've used in order to sow fear and to maintain control over the society. In Nicaragua, in Venezuela, and Cuba, there are children, there are elderly, there are youth and pregnant women or breastfeeding women whose only crime has and to think, want, and to insist on dignified conditions, living conditions, and to exercise their basic human rights, and to have access to democracy, and exercise their right to vote, their right to worship, and freedom of expression, organization, and assembly. There are political prisoners who, when democracy is in crisis or has collapsed because of the rise of these authoritarian regimes. This is the current reality of our continent. I spent the past 20 months in solitary confinement. I woke in the night when they came to the cells to take out neighboring prisoners to interrogate them, and I couldn't go back to sleep until they had returned. I thought so many times of the horrifying suffering that men and women had to endure throughout the past century under all of the military dictatorships of the southern part of the continent. That people who would leave and that nobody knew when or if they would return with life. And many of these individuals left without were taken without a trace. I cannot even imagine this because it hurts to do so. Solitary confinement is a brutal form of torture that nobody should have to endure for any amount of time. It has been designed to damage the mental integrity of prisoners. In Nicaragua, Marvin Vargas, for example, has been in this condition under these conditions for the past 6 years, and the Bishop Rolando Alvarez spent 9 months in isolation. We have another individual who has been also isolated. Nothing I am saying is news. There must be action, and we need to take a zero-tolerance attitude toward these governments and the regimes that impose kidnapping, prisoners, political prisoners, as well as torture. Zero tolerance must be adopted in terms of torture for those who practice it and who carry it out. Zero tolerance for solitary confinement, and zero tolerance for the parade of political prisoners that die in prison under shadowy circumstances. We need zero tolerance from the social movements, organizations, and governments, as well as the media. Zero tolerance with no ifs, ands, or buts, and no excuses. It is unacceptable to look the other way when we're talking about grave violations of human rights. Today, there are more than 3,167 political prisoners in the Americas. In Nicaragua, since 2018 to the date, human rights organizations that work from exile have recorded more than 5,000 individuals who have been jailed by the dictatorship, who have this seems to worry them very little. So despite what the jailers say, the monitoring and surveillance or vigilance of the human rights organizations and the inter-American justice system, as well as they don't care about international sanctions or the constant reminder of what they are doing. These voices, your voices, all of the voices that demand that political imprisonment comes to an end, do serve as encouragement for those who are imprisoned. Please, let's maintain our voices loud and clear. Our challenge is to bring political imprisonment to an end. One more day is too much. All of the people who are prisoners of conscience must be freed. And not just simply, these people can't just be let free from jail or banished. All jails in which political prisoners are incarcerated should be eliminated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Teles, for sharing your personal experience and your perspective with us, and we hear your call. I now invite the representatives of member states to offer their comments and observations on the topics and the presentations we have heard this morning and this afternoon. Again, please be reminded of the 5-minute maximum for each intervention as stipulated under the rules of procedure of the Permanent Council. The floor is now open, and I see we have a request from Chile. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. In particular for including this item on the agenda, which is especially important to consider on this day, the Human Rights Day. Chile, it's a few delegations now have requested this topic of the situation of persons deprived of liberty for political reasons in the Americas, memory and present. And memory because it forms part of the history of our country, Chile. Chile, people who thought differently were punished. Jose Carlos Zamora said this, that the use of political imprisonment is not a unique tool, but it does always carry the badge of intolerance. In Chile, when thousands of people were disappeared or murdered, there were many more that were abused, detained, tortured, and many more exiled. And in this context, Chair, political imprisonment is something that Maria Tellez pointed out, and that is to sow, the purpose is to sow fear. But then we have the cultivation of fear in the face of which resistance has developed. And this was key in the triumph of democracy. Now, this is what I would say, that this is not necessarily a decisive factor, but I think it was very important in recovering democracy, and this is what has motivated us to bring this topic up, to remember the damage that the damage that the victims have suffered. And we believe that the memory of victims of political imprisonment, both in Chile and the entire hemisphere, should be honored, and we must be able to tell those stories. And this is indispensable to avoid repeating history. And we need to do so through preservation of memory. Now, this task of bringing visibility to prisoners, of political prisoners, is not easy. In our country, we recognize only 14 years after recovering democracy did we establish a group to recognize the victims of the dictatorship. So this visibilization is important, and it invites us to talk about a subject that is challenging. This is the topic we're addressing today, and can be viewed from different perspectives, and we also have concrete examples and situations. And that's why we find this such an important topic, and important to hear from Mr. Mendez. And he highlighted the fact that he who uses violence to interrupt the democratic process cannot be a democratic prisoner. And so we understand that these topics do require an understanding of the diversity of visions and positions that come together that can enrich our collective action. And that requires, and this is something we learn on a daily basis, it requires flexibility, dialogue, as well as it requires us to put us in the shoes of the other, as well as consensus. We need to understand that we can find common ground. which is, this is a collective task that we face. And in the UN's language, this is a task that is called protecting. And within our American language, it's a collective responsibility. And we have the obligation to act, to collectively contribute as states to protect human rights and democracy throughout the region. It's not enough to just have an inter-American system if the states do not act accordingly so that this system is useful or has useful application. I would like to thank all of our panelists, Mr. Mendez, Ms. Tejes, and Mr. Zamora, for their presentations. And we have seen that this allows us, the memory allows us to face the past to change our present and future.
Now offer the floor to the delegation of Costa Rica. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Chair and distinguished members of the Permanent Council, good afternoon to everyone. Today we have heard testimonies that are moving, that ask us as individuals and representatives of our states to listen. The voice of Dr. Juan Mendez, who was a political prisoner in Argentina, the example of Ms. Dora Maria Tejes, who is a symbol of sacrifice and the struggle in Nicaragua, and the statements of Jose Carlos Zamora that reminds us of the persecution of those who protect and promote truth in Nicaragua, in Guatemala. So thank you to all of you for being with us in this session and for sharing your testimony. These are more than anecdotes. They are living denouncements and proof that this type of political imprisonment persists in our region. Within the framework of the Human Rights Day, Costa Rica would like to make a clarion call for the members of the OAS to assume our collective responsibility and to double down on our efforts in terms of promoting freedoms and human rights everywhere, empowering the new generation so that they can be agents of change and promote these principles, and to strengthen multilateralism, because it is only through regional and international cooperation can we face our complex and common challenges. Costa Rica reiterates its commitment to the construction of a future based on peace and fundamental rights. Just yesterday, within the celebration of the International Day of Human Rights, we held the International Conference for Peace in San Jose. This initiative was organized by my ministry in the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, as well as with the support of the UN and the EU in Costa Rica, brought youth from all over the country to come together to carry out an intergenerational and proactive dialogue. In the words of the Vice Minister, Solano Ortiz, this event represents a chapter penned by Costa Rica in the book of our plan for the future, and it included youth participation as a driver for preventing violence and the strengthening of a culture of peace. The conference allowed youth to meet not only with government representatives and international agents, but it also allowed them to establish a call to action and include their voices in the implementation of the future pact of the UN and a new future of peace. I'd like to highlight Costa Rica's leadership in inclusive and sustainable initiatives. We continue to work together to promote human rights and a culture of peace, amplifying the voice of the youth and transforming our commitments in concrete and sustainable actions. Thank you so much, President.
Thank you, Ambassador. We now offer the floor to the delegation of Panama. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to the Permanent Mission of Canada, Chile, Costa Rica, the United States, and Guatemala jointly and severally, for asking that this matter be debated at this special meeting. It is a grievous issue and an urgent one. Persons who have been deprived of liberty for political reasons in the Americas, that's a tall order. But on this day, when we celebrate human rights, we do well to remember that we're talking about a direct violation of the fundamental freedoms of liberty, dignity, and justice. No more, no less. And so let me begin by recognizing the bravery of those who are speaking up. Mr. Juan Mendez, Ms. Dora Maria Telles, and Mr. Jose Carlos Zamora, whom we have heard. Each one of them has spoken of resistance, pain, and hope. Mr. Juan Mendez, who was deprived of liberty in Argentina over the military dictatorship today, is a very respected human rights academician and a former specialist of the United Nations on torture. He's specialist on the matter. He's been there. He knows what commitment to justice can entail. And we are also reminded that behind every case of political imprisonment, we're meeting humans, human beings, whose justice must also be guaranteed. We heard Ms. Telles, Nicaragua, who lived terrible moments because of her defense of democracy and her recent experience, tells us that this is a pattern of systematic torture and persecution that continues until this day. Dora Marina is telling us that repression can never be the last chapter in a life committed to freedom. And the case of José Rubén Zamora, the newspaper person, founder of El Periódico, the famous newspaper in Nicaragua, tells us also what happens to those who seek the truth. His son, José Carlos Zamora, has become a tireless voice crying in the wilderness against this justice. Freedom of the press is a fundamental freedom in any democracy. Today, more than ever, we certainly need a collective commitment to make sure that these stories and so many others are known, are published, and are recognized to be standard bearers for justice. Defense of human rights is what we're talking about. This isn't just statistics. We're talking about real human beings with families, with dreams, with a deep desire to live in peace and in freedom. To put this item on our agenda today, I think, is a huge step forward, and I would beg that this forum not only be a forum for us to reflect, but also to plan direct action. We need to send a very clear message. We cannot simply sit here and talk about the fact that repression can be accepted. Juan Mendez has said torture and repression can never be accepted in a society that calls itself democracy. That statement should push us to recognize that the fight for human rights is not one day's fight or an overnight fight. It is an ongoing fight, and I would beg you all to remember that. History shall judge us not by our words, but by our action. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We now offer the floor to the delegation of Colombia. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes y muchas gracias.
I thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. I appreciate the effort taken by the countries that have asked to have this issue put before us, as the Ambassador for Panama has so fluently and cogently described it. This International Day in which we celebrate human rights gives us an opportunity to underscore, again with regard to political imprisonment, the adoption in December of 2023 in Colombia under Presidential Directive 07 to recognize the work of those who defend human rights in Colombia. Until 2 years ago, human rights defenders were persecuted, were thrown into jail, and summarily assassinated. That is the history until just 2 years ago. Today, we're talking about an environment that needs to be secure, free from all kinds of threats or bias, and including a clear recognition of the important role that the defenders of human rights are playing, strengthening democracy, no more, no less. And this should prompt us to have a more intersectional view of public policies. Chair, I would simply underscore here the firm commitment of President Gustavo Petro, the President of Colombia, and his Vice President, Marcia, for the upholding of human rights. And it behooves me also to mention the very valuable and ongoing relationship that Colombia has kept with the Human Rights Commission as of 2 years ago, particularly with the International Commission on Human Rights, and we are so pleased by the re-election of the Executive Secretary. That commission, as my colleagues have said here, plays indubitably a key role in the pinpointing and making more visible of the roles that the state has to promote and protect those rights. Over April and May, we presented before the Human Rights Commission points that we had brought before the Inter-American Court on Human Rights within a consultative opinion on an issue that we are debating with Chile. There was a recognition of the role of the Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples in protection of the environment, the rights of nature, and the defense of climate migrants, as they are known. These indigenous peoples, descendants of Afro-descendants, were until just recently persecuted, jailed as political prisoners, only because they were carrying out that work. And they were summarily tortured and, I'm sorry to say it, killed, assassinated as a result of this. Now, the Rapporteurship for Freedom of Expression of the IACHR and the Rapporteur Pedro Vaca, together with us, worked on what Mr. Carlos Zamora has discussed. That is a presidential decree that shows the nexus between the newspaper, the media, and the presidency. The pillars of democracy are now recognized to be these freedoms of the press. And Colombia now works very, very hard to establish that the respect for such rights is recognized by every public servant, civil servant. This is a 180-degree turnabout, because until now, it was very different. The great media were experts at falsifying news, twisting elements, without any way or any effort to discuss what the truth might be. And this was falling flat into hate speech, without ever recognizing the role of the government and what needs to be done to avoid what has happened to Mr. Zamora. And so this really is a paradigm of how things should happen. And so now, in 2024, we have worked on that. We have equally worked on leading a group of friends fighting for Afro-descendants' rights. The rights of individuals and peoples of Afro-descendant origin in the Americas is now at the heart of discussions that we're having with civil society and with other states, and we will be having them with the OAS. So thank you very, very much, Chair, and the help of the Social Department here at the OAS to help us help the African descendants among us, led by Gloria de Mes. This meeting gives us a chance to look and see how far we've come and how firm our commitment remains to uphold human rights. Everybody has said that it makes no sense, indeed it is criminal, to pursue, to jail, and ultimately to kill people simply because they look different and they think differently. Where does that lead us? And so we ask the protection of everyone for a better battle on protection to those who think differently, and that we should rely more on dialogue and on a regional position. We need to think that this has to do with social dignity and freedom for all of the inhabitants of the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We now offer the floor to delegation of Guatemala. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair, distinguished panelists, representatives. In honor of the Human Rights Day, this is one of the most important celebrations that we can hold here in this organization. The Organization of American States, whose principles bring us together in terms of protecting dignity, democracy, liberty, and the guarantees that ensure peaceful coexistence, the most peaceful possible. Guatemala was one of the countries that wanted to discuss this topic today, but we have a persistent scourge on our continent, which is that of people who have been deprived of liberty for political reasons. This reflects systems that allows this sort of treatment, and what we need to do is continue to discuss these topics regardless of how uncomfortable they are. And we can't look the other way when we're talking about political prisoners. We must listen to the Professor Mendez, Ms. Tejes, and Mr. Jose Carlos Zamora, the son of Mr. Jose Ruben Zamora, whose experiences have served to show us that we need to join forces to fight against arbitrary imprisonment. And we are deeply concerned how they and their family members have experienced extremely painful incidents after being deprived of liberty. The system of the protection of human rights by means of the court is important to restore their rights. And despite solid institutions within the American system, victims continue to be vulnerable to anti-democratic efforts when the democratic states fail. This is a practice, the dictatorship is a practice that should have stayed in the past. Unfortunately, this continues to this day. During the armed conflict in Guatemala, it wasn't strange to be exiled, having to leave their family behind and having had very painful experiences. The 20th century brought with it a framework of legality and an effort to change this, but there are still individuals linked to that conflict, and these actors have co-opted high positions in courts and in prosecutor's office. In the latest years, we have been witness to abuse of the criminal justice system, and in 2023, the prosecutor's office was accused of using the Attorney General's office against the presidential candidate Arevalo at the time. Journalists and human rights activists, and judges and prosecutors that investigate corruption have been victims as well. The case that we heard about today from Jose Carlos Zamora, this journalist spent more than 2 years in prison and faces a great risk of returning to prison. Nevertheless, this is not the only case of its nature. Virginia La Parra, who is a former prosecutor, also was imprisoned for more than 2 years. And she was accused of abuses of power in the exercise of her work. Recently, the Attorney General has imprisoned the former Deputy Hernandez and persecuting Carlos Luis Font, a journalist, who faces an international arrest warrant. We have people at every level that are being were persecuted. And this has all been clearly documented and condemned by many international organizations. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights invited Guatemala in July of this year, and the ACNUR, or the High Commissioner's Office of the UN for Human Rights, to discuss how to put an end to these practices. Guatemala believes that as a hemisphere, we need to promote observance of human rights, and we must uphold minimum standards in courts. And we believe in international solidarity And that's why we received 135 individuals from Nicaragua who were deprived of their liberty. And that's why I believe that it's important that we promote an international day, Inter-American Day against political imprisonment. And with all of our efforts, we can establish a more precise definition of individuals that are deprived of their liberty for political reasons. And as state, we must commit to prevent the persistence of these painful incidences. Thank you.
We now offer the floor to the delegation of Peru. Please proceed.
Señor Presidente.
Chair, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to speak to you on the Day of Human Rights. On this date, we are invited to reflect on what our humanity is defined as, the ability to act in a responsible and free manner despite being restricted by our circumstances, to seek an end and using the proper mechanisms to do so. This ability emanates from our human condition, and it pre-exists, it comes before the state. The state, rather, exists in order to recognize and protect this capacity, this ability. As Eleanor Roosevelt has said, one of the principal architects of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a right isn't something somebody should give you, but rather a right is something that no one can take from you. And certainly, the Declaration of 1948 was a historic declaration, but we cannot forget that it was preceded by the work of different schools of thought and thinkers, among whom we have the contributions of Salamanca. In particular, the thinking of Francisco de Vitoria, who holds a special place in the hearts of those in this room. And in 1492, with the discovery of the Americas, and in particular with the 1532 conquering of Peru, all humans, independent or regardless of their race, have the same rights. Bartolomé Las Casas defended the indigenous before the king and courts of Spain. Modern Peru is very clear, has very clear this idea that's developed in its region. The first article of the Constitution says that the defense of the human and respect for their dignity is paramount. On this International Human Rights Day, we'd like to renew our commitment to these universal values. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We now offer the floor to the Dominican Republic. Please proceed.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you so much, Chair. We'd like to thank the delegations of Canada, Chile, Costa Rica, the United States, and Guatemala for requesting that this important topic be included on today's order of business. And we'd also like to thank the panelists for the valuable presentations. Chair, in the 20th century, Latin America and the Caribbean lived under authoritarian rule, and they exercised severe repression and used political imprisonment to silence opposition. In many countries throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, phenomena such as forced disappearances, political persecution, and human rights violations are realities that persist to this day and that continue to threaten the freedom of our citizens. Arbitrary detentions and political imprisonment, as well as grave human rights violations, as well as forced disappearance and torture, are practices that in many cases constitute crimes against humanity according to international law. And these regimes use imprisonment as a tool to repress dissidents and thus ensure their control. and strengthen their control. Chair, people that are jailed for political reasons are in particular vulnerable, and they are subjected to inhumane psychological and physical abuse. They don't receive medical attention, and the family of political prisoners tend to report or denounce these abuses publicly, but the authoritarian regimes continue with impunity. Political imprisonment and violent retaliation seek to repress the civil society actions and leads to a dangerous situation in those countries that live with authoritarian regimes. And it's important to highlight that women that are deprived of their liberty for political reasons face different types of challenges due to their gender. They oftentimes face gender violence and torture as well as abuse that are used as punishment, humiliation, and repression, and in many cases due to their historic role as social leaders. And lastly, we would like to make an urgent call to free all political prisoners and the adoption of decisive actions in order to enforce democracy in the region. And we urge the countries of our region to work together in order to guarantee the full exercising of human rights within the inter-American system, and to guarantee the respect of democratic constitutions. Thank you very much, Chair.
We now offer the floor to the delegation of Paraguay. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We too would like to express our thanks to the delegations that have brought this very key issue before the Council, and to thank each of the panelists for their statements. The question of political prisoners, alas, is an old one for this region. It's an insidious practice that has marked much of the history of each one of our countries, and I include my own Paraguay. After so many dictatorial regimes simply made a great many people disappear, anybody who disagreed. And we know that Carne, 18,900 persons were detained illegally or in arbitration between 1974 and 1989. This was unjust, and because human rights were so violently disregarded, we know whereof we speak, and we're deeply, deeply concerned by the increasing number of people who are being detained as I speak in the Americas, because some people want to shut them up. No criticism is alive, particularly not if it's criticism of political individuals. And so we call on everyone to abide by basic principles of human rights and understand that no one should be detained and thrown into jail without just cause. And everyone has a right to due process. For that, of course, we need efficient legal procedure and an independent judiciary. Chair, we are convinced that democracies can only be strengthened in a spirit of plurality and inclusion, in which all sectors of society are involved and in which the freedom of thought and expression is paramount. And we can only hope that this will guide us all. Thank you.
Thank you. We now offer the floor to the Holy See. Ambassador, please proceed.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. The Holy See is deeply grateful for being present in this session and commemorate the International Day for Human Rights. This is a red letter day, and we are honored to celebrate with you. And indeed, yes, to touch on a few of the matters that have arisen in this decision, in this discourse and meeting. The General Assembly of the United Nations adopted, a few months after the Inter-American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, adopted one on human rights. This was in December. and it remains a pillar and a reference of human rights for the system until today. This is based on the diversity of human beings, which has been granted by God Almighty, and knowing, as we know, that there are inalienable duties and liberties and rights that come with that creation. These are necessary for the well-being of the individuals and certainly for the creation of countries that can operate democratically. And the Holy See very much supports this, not only where individuals are involved, but where communities are involved. And we believe that this is not just a question of a state or any other collectivity. These are rights that are inherent to each individual, God-given rights, we believe. And human rights, therefore, granted by the Almighty, as we believe, should not only be seen under the legal perspective, but as an essential sine qua non element that will allow the human being to develop and become what he or she were meant to be. And so on this day, when we celebrate human rights and are pondering the lack of these rights for so many hundreds and thousands of people in the world, indigenous peoples, prisoners of conscience, those who are deprived of liberty for political reasons, and so many other injustices that we know exist worldwide, victims of extreme poverty, discriminations that, alas, are rampant everywhere we look. Pope Francis, in his very last statement to the diplomatic corps in the Holy See and the Vatican, said, and I quote, "The road to peace demands respect for human rights." This is what was stated clearly and simply in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're talking about a principle, the Pope mentioned, that speaks to rights that are so commonly disregarded. And alas, over the last decades, where so many new rights have been promoted, aren't really rooted in the original rights, and they are not always acceptable, alas. They have given rise to too many elements of strife of an ideological nature. One emerging tendency is particularly dangerous because it presumes equality but respects none. These ideological strifes provoke warfare and dis-ease among the states instead of peace, where it is the opposite that should be at the heart of the international community. This constructive dialogue, the Holy See has continued to urge us to understand, pushes us, or should push us, to work more effectively for human rights that will be recognized and promoted above all others. The Holy See joins its voice with all those who ask for a future of peace, justice, and solidarity, aware certainly that it is only in a spirit of mutual respect and common well-being can we hope to have a future where everyone will find his or her place. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Monsignor, for your very important perspectives. Colleagues, before we close, I'd like to once again offer the floor to Mr. Juan Mendez to wrap up for us. Mr. Mendez, please proceed. Mr. Mendez, can you request the floor, please? It seems we've lost him. I'm sorry. Well, seeing as we have no more requests for the floor, we have now concluded the consideration of the agenda for today's meetings. Today's presentations, along with the comments from delegations, will be reflected in the corresponding minutes of this special meeting. And so I'd like to express our sincere thanks to all of you for your presence and your participation here today. But before adjourning the meeting, the chair wishes to inform delegations that the next regular meeting of the Permanent Council, which will be the last one for 2025, will take place on Tuesday, December 17th at 2:30 p.m. in this same room. The Secretariat will be issuing an invitation for this session no later than tomorrow. So there being no further business to consider, this meeting is adjourned. Oops, sorry. I'm sorry, we have a request for the floor. My apologies. Please proceed, Ambassador.
Gracias, Presidente. Era porque creí que había un...
I'm sorry, I thought we had other business, but I simply wanted to say, as is often said, a parochial bit of news. Today, as we celebrate the International Day for Human Rights, there is a group that has been established here that is called the Group of Ñ being the reference to the N in Spanish, that says today is an important day for the Hispanic community, and we can only hope that we will remember that 100 Years of Solitude, written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the renowned Colombian author, is celebrated also. And we hope that this afternoon here and in the rest of the world, all of us will go to Macondo with the family of Aurelio Buendia. That is the protagonist of that important literature poem. Thank you.
For that very interesting and important addition. So I think now we can say that the meeting is adjourned. Yes, adjourned.